Welcome to Quantum Flux, the podcast of Nonlocal Science Fiction magazine and nonlocalsci-fi.com. I'm your host, the editor of Nonlocal Science Fiction, Dan Dombrowski. I'm joined today by Thad Kanupp, author of the post-apocalyptic Wasteland series Deal Gone Bad. Chapter 1 of Deal Gone Bad appears in issue number 1 of Nonlocal Science Fiction, available now through nonlocalsci-fi.com, amazon.com, the Nook Marketplace, iBooks, and several other ebook marketplaces. You can find a complete list of retailers on nonlocalsci-fi.com. You'll also find an ever-growing pile of articles written by Thad. He has been kind enough to write for the website since he'll be sticking around for a while as Deal Gone Bad continues to grow. His big project at the moment is Jacked In, a chapter-by-chapter read and react to William Gibson's seminal cyberpunk classic, Neuromancer. Welcome to the podcast, Thad.
Thanks for having me.
So let's first talk about Deal Gone Bad. First of all, tell us a bit about the first chapter, about what's in the first issue.
Well, this guy, he has a deal go bad. He's a scavenger. He meets up with some unsavory types who turn on him, which he was expecting, not quite for things to go as badly as they did go, but he runs away and things get worse for him from there. He has a supermarket shelf fall on him. He gets mauled by a dog. It's a bad day in general for him.
Now, where did the idea for the story come from originally?
The story itself, it all kind of expanded out of that opening line. I woke up with a scorpion on my face or something like that. And that just came to me one day, and I went from there. But as far as the sort of the tone of it and the post-apocalyptic setting and stuff came from playing a whole lot of the Fallout video games, was probably my biggest source of inspiration. And then from there, like movies like Book of Eli or The Road, that kind of thing.
And now you mentioned to me that the underlying story of Deal Gone Bad isn't inherently a science fiction story. It's a story of survival with sci-fi elements that are thrown on there for good measure. Why tell the story in a science fiction setting?
Science fiction settings are fun. That's the biggest part of it. I mean, you can have laser guns and all sorts of other not quite realistic things in a science fiction story that you can't have if you're sticking strictly to realism. Like if I had told this story in the aftermath of World War II Europe or something like that, I could have had scavengers and I call them these raider types and stuff. That could have worked, but the kid that shows up at the end with the laser gun or other things that I've got planned on down the line would have to be replaced with something more mundane. And I think it's just more fun for me as a writer and as a reader sometimes to see those science fiction elements.
You wrote an interesting piece for the website a few weeks ago called Saucy Meat, or How Aesthetics Define Genre. First of all, tell us a little bit about the article, and then kind of talk about how your ideas inform your writing, and specifically how they inform Deal Gone Bad.
Well, I see a lot of, I don't want to call it like elitism or anything because that makes it sound bad, but a lot of like genre purists tend to say, and not just in science fiction, but in just about any medium, there's a right way to do something and it can only be done this way. And with science fiction, it tends to be that if you can look at a story and it doesn't absolutely rely on the scientific elements, it's not really science fiction. A lot of people say that about Star Wars, that it's a fantasy story, it's just in a space setting, but really the story itself is just fantasy. The laser swords could be steel swords and it wouldn't make a bit of a difference. And to me, while that might be technically true, I don't see the point in that argument. If it looks like science fiction, then it's science fiction. Flash Gordon is science fiction just as much as 1984 is science fiction or A Space Odyssey is science fiction. I mean, it doesn't really have to be science-based so much as science-flavored. And as far as how that went into Deal Gone Bad, I wasn't really concerned with making it the science really a major aspect of the story. Post-apocalyptic stories tend to be categorized as science fiction just because It's speculative and generally focuses on the cause of the apocalypse. And you could even say, depending on the story, that it's social science fiction because it's talking about survivors and how societies adapt to a catastrophe like that. But that's all a lot of literary analysis kind of stuff that I don't really care about as a writer or a reader. It's fun to think about, but at the end of the day, I just want to be entertained and maybe have some cool thoughts. I don't really care about the labels attached to them. And so the whole idea of ethics being how we define a genre is just an at a glance kind of thing. If you look at something and it looks like science fiction, it's okay to call that science fiction. Whether if you hold it up to intense academic scrutiny, if it really would qualify as science fiction isn't all that important.
Yeah, there's an old quote, and I never know who to attribute this to. I knew at one point, but I always forget. But it's that science fiction is fiction that is possible, but oftentimes you wish it weren't. Whereas fantasy is fiction that is not possible, though oftentimes you wish that it were. And Deal Gone Bad, certainly it is possible, and you probably don't wish that it would be. It's definitely a science fiction story, regardless of whether or not there's a ton of sci-fi elements in there or not. Regardless of, as you said, it's a wasteland story. It is, maybe it's more on the social side of things, but it's still definitely it very much is science fiction. Your main character in the story, Jack, he's a bit of an anti-hero. He's a survivor, obviously, given how long he made it in the wasteland. He never strikes me as a particularly likable kind of guy, but he's also not a bad guy. I'm sure that'll develop in further chapters. But overall, he's just a guy with some average survival skills dealing with what life has thrown at him to this point. Is that a pretty fair description?
I think he wants to be a good guy. He talks some about his sister who raised him, which is fleshed out more in the next episode. But he's just grown so cynical and paranoid in dealing with life in the wasteland that he wants to be a good guy, but he doesn't want to take the risks associated with that. He doesn't really want to go out on a limb for someone unless there's something in it for him, because of how likely it is that whoever he's trying to help will just try to take advantage of him.
Sure. Now, I know we've talked, I think via email, a bit about Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Jack has more than a few things in common with the main character there, Roland Deschain. You've told me that you've never actually read those books. You did mention a couple movies earlier. So where exactly does Jack come from? Is he inspired by anything directly?
I'm not entirely sure. I kind of just wanted to think about the type of setting the type of person that setting would produce. He's got a little bit almost of a like a 30s pulp, like a hard-boiled detective feel to him. I think just that cynicism and the propensity for flowery descriptions and stuff. Especially in that opening paragraph, he got really long-winded about that. But I don't know. A lot of times, like, I can trace a character back to, like, okay, I'm taking this character and adding elements of this famous character and making something new. But I don't know if he's so much inspired by another character as just he has a few like he's more a product of genre mixing, really. Like, putting a sort of a hard-boiled detective attitude into a post-apocalyptic story and just seeing what popped out. It goes back to the Fallout games relied a whole bunch on that aesthetic of 50s B-movie science fiction. And it was kind of like that. I didn't want it to be, Fallout fan fiction, but just trying to see, mixing up these different feels, what would come of that.
I copy edit for a publisher on occasion, and it was a Western. It wasn't science fiction. It was a Western story, but there was a line in it about the main character, and it had a bit of a noir-esque feel to it at times as well. But the line was, "Emmett was a top shelf nobody," and I always that line, for whatever reason, is always stuck in my head, and I thought it applied very nicely to the world you've created, and specifically to this character of Jack.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't have the story right here in front of me, and I'm actually kind of sick of it as many times as I've read it. But he's got that whole monologue at the beginning about how rough the world is, and how he's barely hanging on to survival, and that's put him a step above most other people, in spite of the fact that he's not doing all that great himself. I can see how that connects right there.
How long of a series do you see Deal Gone Bad becoming? Do you have a definite plot arc in mind with a certain number of chapters, or is it pretty open-ended at the moment?
I've tried outlining it, and that just confuses me more. I know there's certain elements I want to introduce at certain points, and certain things that are going to happen, and I have a general idea of how it's going to end. But how all that will fall, how much can fit in a single chapter, and how much will have to be spread out over multiple chapters. My initial target was around 5 or 6. I mean, I don't think it's going to stretch into like a novel length thing by the time it's all done, but it could be twice that many chapters. I don't really know at this point. I really don't know how long anything is going to be until I start writing it.
Don't spoil anything for listeners, or even for me for that matter, because I've yet to even see a second chapter. But can you give us a little tease about what lies ahead for Jack?
Knights in shining armor.
Okay, that sounds interesting. I look forward to reading the next chapter. Jumping over to the personal side of things, how old were you when you started writing?
Old enough to write. I've been a really intense reader for as long as I can remember, and I think a lot of kids that get into reading at a young age try to get into writing at a young age, and I did that, and mostly it was just awful stuff that should never see the light of day. It was practice, as far as actually like, all right, I'm going to be a writer, not just somebody who writes some stuff sometimes. That was my senior year of college during Christmas break. I just decided I want to write a fantasy novel, and I haven't read that much fantasy aside from like Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff, and wasn't really sure where to start. So I just started looking into it, and it was sort of just a whim that I decided to take seriously. It's the stupidest way to make life decisions, really, but I think I had enough experience writing in English classes and creative writing and stuff like that to once I did decide to actually, all right, I'm gonna be a writer now. I had enough practice that I wasn't just diving into it without having a clue about what I was doing. So I've been writing seriously for about 4 years now, which sounds like a lot, but I really haven't produced all that much, having to work, having to deal with life in general. But more and more I'm focusing on the writing, and hopefully it'll become a career eventually, soon, hopefully.
Would you say that you were a creative kid in general, or was it just the writing?
Yeah, I mean, I never really put a damper on my imagination. I read every book I could get my hand on. I was really into science fiction movies and stuff like Star Wars and Star Trek. We were pretty poor, like not dirt poor, living in a shack, but we didn't get cable TV until I was like 12. I had 3 channels before then, and it was a whole lot of it was just making my own fun and running around with imaginary friends. I lived in not a really rural area, but it wasn't like I could go down the block to meet all my friends either. So I mostly had to entertain myself, and a lot of that was encouraged by my parents. So it all just kind of bubbled up until I became a creative adult.
So you were reading a lot. Would you say you were, kind of a literature nerd in school, or were the classics that you had to read for class more of a struggle for you?
Oh man, I got in a nasty fight with an English major about this just the other day. I never really enjoyed the classics that much. They were really hit or miss for me. The Great Gatsby in particular, I just couldn't stand. I loved Frankenstein. I thought Lord of the Flies was all right. I thought Catcher in the Rye was all right. 1984 was decent, but for the most part, I wanted to read my own stuff. I mean, a lot of the kids I was in, the assigned reading was the only reading they were doing. And for me, the assigned reading was distracting me from the two or three other books I was trying to read at the same time.
What exactly was this argument about the other day with the English major?
The validity of teaching canon works, the great American novels and stuff like that. And my argument was that if more modern or more accessible to a modern high school student type of works could be used to teach the same lessons, they shouldn't be using something that was going to lose the kids by the second page.
Yeah, certainly. I think that, you hand kids something written by a modern master, not even a modern literary master, but a modern, someone who writes accessible pop fiction, but that's still very well written. Somebody like Stephen King. I think you're going to have a lot more luck getting kids into reading and getting them to appreciate the different concepts than you are trying to hand them The Grapes of Wrath or something like that. I agree.
Which isn't even to say that those aren't excellent works of art. I just think that's a little dense for, especially when you're dealing with a lot of high school students who only read what they're told to read in school. They don't really. It's like teaching them how to drive in an Indy car.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. What did you end up studying when you went off to college?
I majored in film and broadcasting. I got a Bachelor of Arts degree in film and broadcasting, and that was pretty much it. I've used I took a whole bunch of history electives, but going into school, I was going to be I just had my heart set on being like a sound engineer in a recording studio or something. And once I got to school and the realities of an underfunded, under-equipped media department set in, and I really got into film. And then beyond that, since then, I've just done a little bit of freelancing here and there. But a lot of people said, it's a useless major. Most of you aren't going to be able to make any use of it, or you're not going to be the next Quentin Tarantino or anything like that. But I learned a lot of stuff I wanted to learn, and I think it helped me out a lot as a writer too, learning how to tell stories with a different medium and that kind of thing.
Now, I suppose maybe I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but you're actually joining us today from the U.S. Virgin Islands. How'd you end up there?
My fiance is getting her master's degree in marine and environmental science down here. So a couple weeks ago, I moved down here to be with her. She's got about 3 or 4 months more to go on her thesis about photo sea slugs. And I came down here looking for work and to try to, sort of take a working vacation and maybe jumpstart my writing as well, since I've got some tropical island stuff in the works for a fantasy book that maybe might one day come into existence.
Do you have any specific plans for when you get back stateside here in a little bit, aside from working as a highly paid staff writer for the hugely successful nonlocalsci-fi.com?
Not right now. I'm mostly just winging it because Ariel, my fiance, she's looking at science jobs, and we're gonna be getting married in the next year or so, and it's pretty much gonna be me following wherever she has to go to work, which is probably gonna be on a coast somewhere for a marine scientist. So the immediate time frame is just do what I can to make what money I can regardless of career goals or that kind of thing. There's only so much I can do until we get established somewhere and actually have time to let a job go for more few months at a time and build things up. And in the meantime, I'm hoping to crank up the writing with my own stories, as well as the articles and stuff on Nonlocal, just for practice, as well as to kind of expand my footprint and build a portfolio.
Turning back to the writing and what you're able to do at the moment, are you someone who gets in a daily routine? Do you have a daily routine yet, having just moved? What's your ideal sort of workflow for writing on a daily basis?
I don't have one. That's probably my biggest fault as a writer. I think Stephen King said you should write 1,000 words a day or something like that. And I'm not a creature of routines at all. If it was my job and I had to get up every day and go sit in a cubicle, I could probably hammer out how much I'm supposed to be writing every day. But for me, it's more of a stroke of inspiration kind of thing. When the lightning strikes, I'll sit down and I'll bang out 2,000 or 3,000 words, and then I'll sit there for weeks just mulling over ideas and not actually getting anything on the paper. It's not the most productive way to go about things as far as word count goes, but I think it's better for the long term, as far as generating ideas and making sure the version I do write down is the version I'm most happy with. Because a lot of times when I've tried to force myself to write every day, I'm just typing to get words on the paper, and the next time I go back, I end up erasing everything I just wrote because I got into a weird groove that went off in a completely different direction that really had nothing to do with where I wanted to take the story. So I can see how if I had a routine, things would be much better for me, and maybe if I could train myself to do that, things would improve. I'm not anti-routine by any means, but it just doesn't seem to be the way my brain wants to work as far as writing goes.
So when you do get the inspiration, when you have a day when you've got an idea and you want to sit down and you have the time to write, where do you do it most of the time?
Well, before I moved, I was living with my parents, and I sat in my room at my desk and wrote. And a lot of times it would be in the middle of the night, 3-4 o'clock in the morning is when I would finally be at that point where I was exhausted enough that I couldn't argue with myself. I would just kind of sleep drunkenly, vomit stuff onto the paper, which actually turned out pretty well, since that's the way most of Deal Gone Bad was produced. Right now, I'm using Ariel's tablet and just setting up on the kitchen table or by the pool or in a science lab or whatever, and just writing wherever I happen to be at the time.
I'll be interested to see how the change in setting and the change in even what you're working on informs and changes your style and your writing in general.
I hope it's for the better.
Well, based on everything you've been writing for the website lately, I'd say that it definitely has not taken it in a negative direction.
Well, that's good.
Other than obviously Neuromancer, is there anything that you're reading at the moment?
No. I spend a lot of time on the TV Tropes website, just wandering around and reading about things I've already read. I did notice at the place where we stay, there's a pool with poolside bathrooms with a little library of paperbacks in it, and Michael Crichton's Timeline was in there. And so I think that's going to be next on my list once I get Neuromancer out of the way. That's
good. I remember reading that quite a while ago. It might have been even grade school or high school when I read that one. It's definitely a good read. If you've ever seen the movie, the book does not. The book far surpasses the movie. The movie's pretty terrible, as I remember it.
Yeah, I was a big Michael Crichton fan in middle school and high school and read just about everything I could get my hands on, but that one somehow passed me by. So now that I've found it and it's free, I'm gonna take advantage.
What book would you say has influenced you the most as a writer?
K.A. Applegate's Animorph series. I read between the ages of like 8 and 14 as it came out, and that series, it's for kids. It's a young adult series on like a fifth grade reading level or something like that. But it was something like 60 books long, and it was a really graphic, gritty kind of story, especially for that age level. There was a lot of gruesome stuff going on, and real heavy themes of genocide and mind control and all this kind of stuff. And I think it really shaped what I was doing as not what I was doing. I wasn't really writing back then, but what I was kind of what my brain liked in a story. It shaped my taste as a reader and a writer.
So other than Applegate, with the Animorph series, what authors inspire you?
George R. R. Martin is the big one. And from him, just he writes stories that I like to read. It's this a focus on characters, a focus on realism, at least in the way people interact and act and their motivations, that sort of gray and gray morality instead of black and white. There are no really good guys or bad guys, just people that have opposing interests. He does a lot of what I like in a story. But as far as authors that I admire just for their accomplishments and stuff, probably Tolkien, obviously, as a guy who just took his hobby and wrote to support it, as far as building Lord of the Rings off of being a linguistics nerd. And Arthur C. Clarke in the science fiction world, he's a fun guy. I've read a whole bunch of his short stories, and he really nails that whole twist that the pulps really loved. And that's something that I don't really know that much about him as a person, but he obviously was very successful with that, and his involvement in movies like Space Odyssey and stuff later on. That's a really cool story for someone, at least for me, who I haven't really read up on it that much. But when I think about him, it makes me happy. So if I could end up like him, I'd be all right.
You ever read any of Philip K. Dick's short stories? You mentioned you like the sort of the twist ending.
I feel like I've probably come across some, but I can't think of any by name. I haven't read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? That one is on the list eventually. The big one. But aside from that, it's just so much of the time I remember stories better than I remember authors. So I don't know if I've read him or not.
But you also mentioned George R. R. Martin and how you're a big fan there. Are you getting as frustrated as everybody else with the delays in getting book number 7 out?
Well, I'm like any consumer, I want my next dose. But as an author, I can sympathize. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to write a book, period. It's a lot of work, like a 5,000 word short story. So I can't imagine what it's like doing a 250,000 word novel that's the 5th book in a series or 6th book in a series of 250,000 word novels. It's a lot of work, so I can definitely sympathize with him. And I would rather have it years late than have a rush job immediately.
Do you have any specific theories or hopes for who comes out on top in Song of Ice and Fire?
I really like Arya Stark, and I like Tyrion, like everyone. But if they have to be brutally murdered to make it a good story, I'm totally on board with that. I'm just here to be entertained.
Do you pull inspiration from anywhere other than what you read in terms of your writing?
Oh, everywhere, yeah. Like I said, the Fallout video games were inspiration for Deal Gone Bad, and a lot of times I'll sit and have music playing in the background, and I'll be playing a game, or I paint miniatures for fun because I do a little bit of everything, and just kind of let my mind wander. And I've come up with entire plots and storylines just based on sitting there listening to music and hearing a funny lyric and thinking, what can I do with that? So yeah, there's inspiration everywhere. I mean, I can see someone walking down the street and think of what someone who looks like that would be like this setting, and just go from there, and the whole thing snowballs. Like, it's really kind of hard to turn the inspiration off.
It's pretty clear from everything you've said that writing is more than just a hobby for you. If you had your way, you'd be a full-time writer. Now, clearly that's a giant mountain to climb, and so many people attempt it and never get there. But assuming that you do, what's one thing that you'd like to look back on your career and see that you've achieved?
Mostly the egotistical answer is that I want to be rich and famous, which wouldn't be bad at all. But if I can just support myself and make a decent living with it, that would be enough, because I would rather be able to make a living doing something I like than to have to make a living doing something I hate, like working at Walmart or wherever, which I've done, and when it was awful. But I'm happy enough just to be able to express myself and know that people are out there reading the stuff I write, and hopefully enjoying the stuff I write. And if that's all I get out of it, plus a modest paycheck, that's enough for me. But I wouldn't be upset at all if I was the next Stephen King or Michael Crichton or George Martin or whoever.
Other than continuing with Deal Gone Bad, you've mentioned a few other projects that you have in mind, but what would you say is the next big thing on the horizon for you, or are you already working on something else?
Oh, man. Well, like you said, I've got a bunch of little things going on just on a constant simmer. But the ambitious thing that got me started seriously in writing these last 4 years was this big fantasy project, sort of like not really an epic story, Game of Thrones style, following a single group of people, but more a series of smaller novels in a single setting, something like Discworld or the Redwall books or something like that. But there's so much going on with that, so much world building involved, and so many different storylines I have ideas for. I've had to force myself to put it on the back burner, because that's what really grabs up my attention. And I know I'm not a good enough writer yet to even attempt to try starting that.
Do you think you'd be quite as ambitious and be looking at writing quite as seriously if digital was not an option currently? If it was even just 20 years ago and no one was really even thinking about ebooks in competition with print publishing, would you still be working as hard knowing that you'd have really no control over whether or not your work was ever available to the public?
Probably not. I mean, I'm sure I would still be, you can't turn the imagination off. So I would still be generating all these ideas and probably keeping stacks of notes and stuff. But without that light at the end of the tunnel, knowing that all I really need to get published is a finished product, I don't have to rely on an agent or a publisher. That option is still there, but really all I need is a good finished product. That's a big motivating factor, because at that point, the only thing stopping me from being published is my pace. As long as I can get out of my own way and finish a book, finish a short story, then I can go on and publish it, and I'm published.
How do you see publishing evolving, big picture? With all the doors that digital opens for you, do you see that taking over? Do you think our kids are going to read print books, or is it just going to be, is a print book going to be a collector's item or retro chic like vinyl is today?
A little bit of both. I'm sure there's always going to be people who prefer physical media. Just it's you own it. You don't have to worry about a server crash eliminating your library or something like that. But for pure portability, I think it would be impossible to try and say that print media is always going to be around the way we've always known it. I don't know if the major publishers will be able to adapt enough to keep the market itself the way it always has been. But I don't think printed books will go anywhere. If anything, very successful self-published authors, instead of inking a publishing deal like E.L. James is the one that springs to mind immediately with 50 Shades of Grey, but she had enough of a fan base. She very easily could have just like crowdfunded through Kickstarter or something a print run and printed the book herself and had a printed copy out there and essentially been her own publisher of a print book. Now, whether somebody wants to go to all that trouble, I think the biggest advantage traditional publishers have is they're already established. They have marketing departments and they have distribution deals with the major retailers and that kind of thing. They've got clout, so I don't think they're going anywhere in the immediate future. But as far as how things will be 10 or 20 years from now, I don't see them really surviving, at least not in the same way they exist right now.
Well, certainly things are going to get a lot more interesting as time goes on. That about does it for the time that we have today. Thank you very much for joining us here today, Thad.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, I've been talking with author Thad Kanupp. The first chapter of Thad's post-apocalyptic wasteland serial, Deal Gone Bad, appears in issue number 1 of Nonlocal Science Fiction, available now on nonlocalsci-fi.com and through major ebook retailers like Amazon, iBooks, and the Nook Marketplace by Barnes & Noble. Thanks for listening to this episode of Quantum Flux, the podcast of Nonlocal Science Fiction magazine and nonlocalsci-fi.com. Join me next week when I'll be talking to indie filmmaker Darren Scales. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode. Music was provided by Kevin MacLeod through incomtech.com.